Welcome, viewers and listeners, to the Total Football Analysis Serie A podcast. We are the Thinking Fans podcast. Each week, we get together with our besties, who are current pro players, real coaches, academics, and stat heads. Join the revolution, which will be televised and podcasted. I'm co-host Chris Mumford, known as the Professor at UNC Chapel Hill. Today, I'm joined by Lori, whom we call Money, as she's always right, from our Sophia Bureau. Also, we have Coach Steve Coleman, whom we call the mailman because he always delivers. He's looped in from our Wellington Bureau. Finally, we have our co-host, Daniele Proch, whom we call 009 because he's a debonair current pro striker at the Raleigh Bureau.
What's up, Chris? Love the nickname. Exactly 100 days after the last game, the Italian League is back. Bentornata Serie A. It was March 9th when the season was postponed after Sassuolo beat Brescia 3-0, and it'll be June 19th when the season restarts with Atalanta hosting Sassuolo. You know, Chris, last Thursday when I heard the news, I celebrated like Cristiano. As soon as I saw the announcement on my Twitter, I went like, "Sue!"
Sweet. Yes, the Serie A scriptwriters will restart the story of 2020 as Lazio tries to break the cycle of winning of the imperious Juventus and their talisman Ronaldo. Upstart Atalanta will try to hold on to its slim lead over Roma on the fourth Champions League spot. Finally, Napoli will have its hands full with three others in the chase, including AC Milan.
So the league will resume June 19th, but the second leg of the Coppa Italia semifinals will play June 13th. Specifically, Napoli will host Inter. The first leg saw Napoli win 1-0 at San Siro thanks to a great curler by Fabiano Ruiz, who made our analyst pre-COVID best 11. And the other fixture will be Juventus against AC Milan. They're starting on a 1-1 aggregate. That game, Ronaldo converted a late PK to equalize AC Milan's lead by Ante Rebic. So just 12 more days, and we'll see Zlatan and Cristiano face off again, Chris.
Will Ronaldo be able to keep his clinical finishing going with 21 goals scored against 17 expected goals? He's been cool as the other side of the pillow. Will the time off reinvigorate his 35-year-old legs to match the stellar Immobile with 27 goals? Yowza, the fixture list will grow as fast and furious as a Roma roundabout at rush hour.
We'll delve deep into pre-game analysis as we approach those restart dates. Today, we will look at the tactics of Inter, a team that has been revitalized under the new leadership of Antonio Conte. Inter currently stands at 54 points with a game in hand, 6 points behind second place Lazio and 7 points shy of Juventus. Our analyst Steve will kick us off by talking about how the rebel Conte this past summer shaped Inter's pressing and counterattack, and how the Lautaro-Lukaku duo is driving the Italian defenses crazy. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Danny. Great to be here again for pod number 2. We're going to discuss Inter today and how Conte's change to his pressing patterns has enabled him to get the best out of Lukaku from a goal scoring perspective. So if we look at the way that they've pressed so far this season, next to me, Chris. So if we look at the last 10 games, Conte's flipped between a 3-5-2 and a 5-3-2, and those things have enabled him to change up how much or how high they press up the pitch. So if we talk about passes per defensive action, they fluctuated from between 5 and 20 throughout the season, and those numbers are based on how many times they get out and press the opposition, depending on the number of passes that opposition makes. So, for example, in the last game against Juventus, those pressing actions were up at around 20 passes per defensive action, which suggests that they sat off a little bit deeper and allowed Juventus to have the ball. Whereas in other games, for example, against Lazio or Milan, where those actions have been down at around 5, so that they've certainly had a lot more of a intention to press the ball higher up the pitch. They don't make a lot of tackles. They certainly rely heavily on interceptions. They average 46 interceptions per game, and from those interceptions, they spring 11 counterattacks on average. And that number varies throughout the season. And of those counterattacks, 2.5 of those counterattacks finish in a shot on goal or on target. So they've certainly created a good counterattacking structure around that. And they've been certainly successful against teams who play a more narrow system. So a team potentially that use maybe a diamond in midfield, a 4-diamond-2 situation, where they don't have the extra players in the wide areas, which has caused them a lot of problems with the players in the wider areas. So when they play against those narrower teams, Conte likes to get after the ball a little bit more, enables his wing backs to get higher up the pitch and press the opposition fullback without having to worry about a winger to deal with it in the top line. So they've been more successful against those teams, and they've certainly been successful defending more in a medium block, where they were able to win the ball back in a more medium position on the pitch and then spring a counter attack from there.
So Steve, question for you: has Conte historically, or at least when he was at Chelsea, had a bit of a reputation for being quite dogmatic in his tactical play? Has that carried over into Inter, or is he becoming more flexible in his tactical elements?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. I think he's been flexible within the team he has. Obviously, they were quite aggressive in the January window there to bring players in that were more Conte players. But I think he's been flexible in terms of how he operates with his fullbacks and how he operates with Lukaku. And as we'll come to a little bit later on, he's certainly getting the best out of him with the ball, but he's accommodating his work without the ball as well. So I think he's had to be flexible, and I think he's had to be certainly a little bit more astute tactically than all guns blazing, pressing hard at the pitch like he was at Chelsea, I think.
Good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Steve, why don't we break down Inter's pressing in one of the last games against Napoli?
Yeah, sure. So against Napoli, they were one of the teams, as I mentioned earlier, that caused Inter a few problems in terms of their width and spreading Inter across the pitch. So we just got some images for you guys out there watching, and for those not, I'll explain those for you. So against Napoli obviously a big team building out from the back. Inter tried very hard to press them from set positions like goal kicks and free kicks from deeper. With 3 players hard at the pitch, which was great, but Napoli still played out, caused them a few problems because a lot of times Napoli would drop the 2 midfield players back into the line to make at times 7 with the goalkeeper against 3 players. So they were able to get out much easier, and it also created a big gap between Inter's front line and everyone else. So next to me, Chris, you also find that in moments where they could, Inter would go high up the pitch, and the 2 front players would lock on to the 2 centre backs, and then the midfield players would also come and join in as well. So there's lots of moments where Inter, for example, press high up the pitch. They send the wing back out into the line to help press higher up the pitch, and then you have moments where they get played around and they get beaten. So anytime that the wing back goes high at the pitch to press is a moment where against Napoli, for example, where they have a problem. So in the image on the screen here, Inter's 3 midfield players have joined Lukaku and Martinez with the pressure, as have both wing backs. And Napoli are able to get out onto the weak side and create a 2 versus 1 against the weak side wing back with the winger and the fullback driving into the midfield space, which causes a real issue for the Inter wing back. As you can see in the image, there are 3 players from Napoli in the top line, which means that Inter's back 5 are pinned in with just 3 players causing them the ability to create an overload in the first 2 lines from Napoli's build up. So when teams are able to do this against Inter, it does cause them a problem. In the 3-5-2 system, as most people out there will know, that the most dangerous spaces are either in front or behind of the wing back on both sides of the pitch, because it's difficult for them to cover those areas with just one player. So if teams like Napoli can get out and cause Inter problems in those areas, then they can have real issues defending those spaces.
Yeah, and Napoli is a perfect example of what you were saying before, that if a team manages to stretch Inter, then they get into real trouble, because then you create 2v1s on the sides, and that's when Inter suffers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that they've certainly got more success defending in a more medium block. It's still a high line comparatively speaking, but once they're able to connect the front two with the midfield three, it makes things a little bit easier. So in this image on the screen for those watching, you can see Napoli building out from the back. They're playing into the fullback, but now instead of the wing back pressing the fullback, you've now got the midfield player coming out to press the fullback, which creates a more compact line, keeps the wing back in the line to deal with the double up in the wide area. And it also allows one centre back to move forward into the next line to press the highest midfield player, which makes a massive difference, because in Inter's case here, it's three central defenders defending one number 9. So it enables one of the central defenders to step out while still having enough numbers to deal with a 4 versus 3 in the top line, as opposed to a 5 versus 3. So in these moments, they're much more successful. It enables them to hurt teams quickly straight into Lukaku and Martinez for counterattacks. And it also accommodates Lukaku's mobility in that top line, where he's able to do enough for Conte to affect the direction of the ball, for example, to the fullback, without actually pressing or doing anything major in terms of turning the ball over.
Can I jump in here, because I've noticed this pattern even now when they defend deeper in a low block, and they play against players. I think it was one of the games, the first game against Atalanta, because they usually use the wings quite effectively, and Inter do this even when they're pinned back, and they use some of the midfielders to go out and support the wing back, and actually one of the center backs joins them too, and they create these defensive triangles in a way to block the creative players that Atalanta had. And actually we've seen this in quite a few games this season, so it's very interesting that they've managed to do this in some games, but they couldn't do it in others. And that brings me back to Conte's flexibility, because I wanted to mention out there that he's more flexible when it comes to making changes game to game, but when it comes to in-game changes and the teams adjusting to their strategy, he has to work on it and improve, because a lot of teams have seen their strategy of their defensive strategy, and they try to expose them in the second half. So I think that he has to work on his in-game tactical changes.
Absolutely. Steve, I'm curious about the role of the two strikers, Lautaro and Lukaku. They scored a lot. They scored something like 28 goals between the two. But defensively, what is their job?
It's a great question. I think when you look at Lukaku during his entire kind of season, he's fundamental to the way Conte wants to attack. So he's had 581 challenges across the season so far. But of those 581 challenges, only 70 of them have been from a defensive standpoint, which, when you consider the amount of games they've played so far, is not a lot at all. When you compare that to Martinez is up at 125. His challenges are 613 across the season, but 125 of them have been defensive challenges. So while they do enough defensively, they're not the pressing front two that potentially he had at Chelsea where they went after the ball a little bit more and able to get the team's heart at the pitch. So they're more defensive forwards. I would say certainly Lukaku is in that mold. But what they do when they win the ball back through their interceptions or in that medium block is they play quickly into those two, and from there they cause havoc. So 15 goals so far for Inter from a counter-attacking perspective. 11 of them have been between these two strikers, and they've had 29 shots for those counter-attacks between the pair of them. So it's been a real dominant performance from Lukaku in certain games, and certainly there has been times where he's been absolutely frightening in those broken play moments where he's able to get forward and run into space and brush people aside. But he certainly doesn't offer the defensive energy and pressing that Martinez has done on the opposite side.
Chris, is this Lukaku similar to the one that we used to know at Everton?
Well, I defer to Steve on that. I do think that it's probably a lot closer to Everton than it is to Man U. It's remarkable how he can just take that ball, and it almost seems like he carries it on his hip and runs to the goal. He can protect that ball so well. Steve, would you say that that's the case? That's his MO?
Yeah, I think he's certainly more Everton-like than Man United-like for sure. While he isn't fundamental to the way they defend, he's certainly very, very powerful in the way they attack, and he's a focal point for them in those moments. So, but he does have an impact on the way they defend for sure. So when you think about Conte's teams, you'd expect them to be kind of pressing, very well organised, press hard the pitch like he was certainly with Italy, and then with Chelsea as well in the Premier League. But they're down in 7th in terms of passes per defensive action, like we talked about earlier, across the league. So that number's down at just under 9, with Bologna, for example, at the top at just over 7. So there's not a great deal of difference between kind of the top 6 or 7 sides in the league in terms of pressing actions. But when you consider, like I mentioned earlier, Juventus in that game, they were down at 20 passes per defensive action, which meant they potentially sat off a lot deeper in that 5 block like Laurie was talking about earlier. But also in certain games like Fiorentina and Milan, where they were up at 5 passes per defensive action. I think they fluctuated quite greatly across the season in terms of the amount of pressing they've done and what they've been able to do. But on the flip side of that, the recoveries that they've got in the games, they're in the top 8. Just under 70 recoveries per game. Atalanta are at the top, just under 79. So there's a little bit of a difference between them. But the amount of balls they win in their own third compared to the rest of those teams above them they're in the top 2. So they win an awful lot of their balls in the mid third and the final third of games against their opposition. And that would lend itself to them still being certainly very much on the front foot and pressing in those 2 areas, but with more subtle variations around where they win the ball back. And I know Laurie's going to talk a little bit now about how important the win backs are, but there's certainly a lot of good work done by their midfield as opposed to them winning the ball higher up the pitch with the front 2 for sure.
Yeah, Laurie, why don't you pick up Steve's assist and you get into final third delivery and the importance of the wing-back role for Inter, which is a trademark of Conte's formations.
Yeah, firstly, I'm going to focus on their final third delivery methods and actually discuss their build-up and how they actually give the ball to Martinez and Lukaku. So the key man in the midfield zone is Marcelo Brozović. He's been very important for the team. His movement and actions on the ball are well balanced out, and he is very important in all areas. It doesn't matter if it's defensively or if it's helping with the final third actions. His passing is used quite a lot, and he's playing the role of a pivot and supporting back, but also going, despite his defensive midfield position, he goes up front quite often and tries to support the team with the ball progression, with the assists, and actually he has quite a good record when it comes to second assists. So his positioning is very important because he's able um, to take actions whenever they need him to. So another thing that they do in their build-up is the use of the house spaces. The midfielders move quite a lot around there, and they actually rely on that movement so they can find pockets behind the defenses and advance the ball and send it to the strikers. So that has helped them a lot in their attacking actions, despite the more active role of the wingbacks, which we will discuss in a minute. They do attack through the middle too, and the use of house spaces and their movement there to drag players out of position and open spaces for the strikers is very important. But in cases when they can't find these these free spaces and they struggle to penetrate and to break the lines, especially against well-structured mid blocks, they tend to use more direct play and send the ball behind the defensive lines from deeper positions. So next we're going to discuss the importance of the wingbacks. And actually, maybe we should have started with them because they're one of the flanks are one of the key areas for the team. The wingbacks are quite active out there, and very important for the team is Candreva, who has actually performed very well uh, this season and is one of the main players to deliver the ball to the final third and the box. He's key for their attacking actions. He's using a lot of crosses, and actually his precision is quite good. And his off the ball movement is one of the things that make him that successful, because usually the wingbacks, their nature is to go back and forth and help defensively and in attack too. But what Candreva is doing is he joins for the defensive actions that we mentioned before, these defensive triangles. But where he positions is mostly between the central line and the final third, the edge of the final third, and he moves off the ball and waits to make a deep run and actually reach the edge of the box and send across to the strikers. So his movement and his despite his age, his speed and accurate actions help the team a lot in their attacking actions.
Yeah, we know that Conte loves himself some hardworking wingbacks. Specifically about Candreva, he's coming off of a tough year under Spalletti. He couldn't really find consistency in playing time. And in fact, this year he already surpassed the appearances that he had last year under Spalletti. And I know, Lori, you have some data about him being leading the Serie A for crosses.
Yes, we can see from his data, we can see that he's actually the leader when it comes to crosses in the league. He's sending average of 7.2 crosses per game, which is quite a high number, and to underline the use of both the left and the right sides of the pitch, we can see that Biraghi is in the top three too. He's in the third place with 5.7 crosses per game, which only shows the importance of both wing backs and that Inter often rely on creating their attacks through the wings. Um, And yeah, but you're right that Candreva has flourished this season and actually plays on his potential and has become a very important part of the team.
I think it's why he's obviously been quite aggressive in the January window as well, bringing in Ashley Young, for example, to give him a little bit more depth in those positions. Would you agree?
Yeah, actually, I'm quite surprised that Young fit the team that well. He didn't get a lot of playing times yet, but I think that as an additional option that goes very well with the team strategy and exactly those that depth that you are talking about. And yeah, in some situations, as we can see, Candreva's movement is very in the half spaces is very important. He tends to cut inside and not only occupy the wings but go to the central areas, and that's where he's also very important because when he exploits the half spaces he tends to shoot from distance quite often, and that way he provides additional threat to the goal.
Yeah, and his shot is pretty powerful. I remember him scoring a worldie this season. The shot just went upper 90. But who has been a little unlucky this season with injuries, and that's Stefano Sensi. How important has it been for Inter, Lori?
Sensi is a player that is a great addition to any team, in my opinion, because he's quite complex and he can help a lot again with the actions in the opposition half. Yeah, he didn't get a lot of playing time due to his injuries this season, but he has shown that he can fit the strategy well. Of course, now Conte has quite a few options in the midfield to choose from, and it will be difficult for him to get the regular into the regular starting 11. But what his role in the team has been always staying on the edge of the final third, always exploiting the half spaces, always looking for advancing the ball and delivering it further. And he's always responsible for supplying with through balls. Although I think when I was looking at the data, his true ball accuracy percentage wasn't that high, which is very interesting. But he has the vision and he has the right positioning to help a lot with these true balls. Maybe he needs to work on his precision more, but I think he could be very important for the attacking actions. And he's also can be used as a direct threat to the goal because he scored 3 goals this season, and his movement and his attack mind nature allows him to place well around and in the box too, which makes him a good option when the team is down with a goal or two, and he can help to go back to normal. And I've made a comparison with Barella just because he's the player that is used on the left central midfield position most frequently, and wanted to see the difference between both in some data. Their pass accuracy is quite close, but we can see that Sensi has a bit of advantage in that area. But I think that this advantage comes just from his work under pressure and confidence on the ball, and also because Barella is mostly is more frequently going back into the defense, and he's being pressed quite a lot, and this makes him to his actions less accurate, and he sends less accurate passes and everything. That's why there is a difference between the two. When it comes to final third actions, we can see from the data that Barella is sending more balls to the final third, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome of them has been better than Sensi's. And when I mentioned that Barella is going defensively more often than Sensi, this could be seen by his directions in the final third and the shots per 90 minutes. And the difference between Sensi's more attacking nature is that he's shooting 3.4 times per game when Barella is barely touching the one shot.
So in what
per game.
occasions would you play Sensi, and in what occasions would you play Barella?
Yeah, I can give. Thank you for the question, because I can give a final opinion on if Sensi needs to sign permanently, because we know he's on loan at the team. But if Conte wants to focus more on penetrating the opposition and their attacking actions, he should choose smartly and choose Sensi. But if he wants to have a player who goes more box to box and drops back in defense and helps with pressing and just some defensive actions, he needs to focus on Barella.
Yeah, Barella can really run forever. Let me show a little bias for the Italy national team here, because we talked about Candreva, Sensi, and Barella. I appreciate how Italian players have been performing under Conte. Sensi, Barella especially, they came from Sassuolo and Cagliari, who are two teams that, they're usually middle to bottom of the table teams. And the transition to such a historical club like Inter is never easy. So for them to perform at this level, I think that we need to give credit to them. And so it's promising to see just Italian midfielders stepping up their game, especially with a view to next summer Euros.
Yes, they really fit very well in his strategy, and they managed to do this in the matter of 2 games. Let's say they really clicked together, and I guess it might be that Italian connection out there that's making them that good of a team.
So, Steve, let me ask you this question here. Inter is a good, solid 8 points off from Lazio. They do have a game in hand. Atalanta is a good 8 points behind Inter, right? So, if I look at the run-in, if there are 13 some odd games left, they do have to face Roma, they have to face Atalanta, and they have to face Napoli, which are all clubs directly below them. Do you think Inter is in a threatened position, or do you think they're going to just kind of stay at that third slot without much threat below, and nor much of an opportunity to move up above? Do you have a take on their run?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, he's been quite aggressive in the January window. Conte bringing players in to add to the depth of the squad. I think he was quite vocal earlier on about not being able to get certain players into his squad, which he's potentially rectified in the January window. Guys like Ashley Young coming in to add depth into those wide area positions. So I think they're in a good spot. I think they were excellent against Juventus, certainly for the first 45 minutes, and they've been excellent for parts of games throughout the season. So they definitely have it in them to remain in that position. But whether they've got enough consistency, whether they've got enough understanding of what Conte expects from them as individuals and as part of a group will be telling. But yeah, I think those games with the teams around them are going to be the telling points for sure.
Lori, if I asked you to look at your crystal ball, how do you see the rest of the season playing out for Inter?
As I mentioned before, I think that the lack of flexibility when it comes to in-game changes would really affect their performance. And when we see, of course, we don't know what's going to be after the break, but when we see Atalanta's performance before it, I think that they could really get closer to Inter, and Inter's performance when it comes to being defensively smart and just think of other options when the other teams just understand their tactics in game. They need to have plan B and plan C, because we haven't seen this throughout the season.
If I
I
can,
think there's going to be a real issue with the number of games in the schedule as well. I think he's already said that he wants to play his youth team against in the Coppa Italia. In that first game to give his players another break rather than kind of thrash them in there early. So I think it's going to depend on how much he can get from his squad players as well, for sure.
it will also depend on whether Champions League and Europa League will come back. So right now Inter has to play Getafe in Europa League, but we know that Juventus has an interesting and tough second leg game against Lyon after losing the first leg. So Inter can definitely exploit this position if Champions League comes back, because Juventus is going to have to focus on two main competitions. So we'll see how will that play out.
You know what I'm really struck by is if you look at the goal differentials, Inter Milan is at 25 and Juventus is at 26, right? And Atalanta is at 36. But I guess it's when you score those goals is what matters. It's been some tied scores has been what's led to Juventus being up by a good solid 9 points. So fascinating stuff on Inter. Thank you so much for that. That wraps up our show today. We would like to thank Total Football Analysis. They are the world's largest open source soccer analytics community. Please visit us at www.totalfootballanalysis.com. Join the revolution.
Signore, signori, that's all for today. Special thanks again to Enrico Italian Bistro for their continued support, as well as the NCFC and the NC Courts Soccer Clubs. See you soon. A presto. Ciao.